I'd like to welcome you to our breakout session on cyber basics. We're running quite a bit behind, so I'm going to jump right in and introduce our panelists. Immediately to my left is Evan Fenaroli. Evan is an underwriting supervisor and cyber liability product specialist in the professional liability division for Philadelphia insurance companies. In his role, Evan manages all aspects of Philly's cyber product, including growth, profitability, marketing strategy, and form development. He has been with Philadelphia since 2008. To his left is John Farley. John is Vice President and Cyber Risk Practice Leader for Hub International Risk Services Division. He's based in New York City, brings 23 years of risk consulting experience to the firm, touching clients across a wide array of industries. He serves as a resource for post-data breach response services, applying his knowledge of best practices to achieve optimal results in cost mitigation. To his left is Jafir Young. Jafir is a senior underwriter for the technology risk underwriting team and project leadership team at Markel Corporation. He began his insurance career with Chubb in the management liability division, also spent time on the other side as a broker with Restrop and Associates, also focusing in management liability and miscellaneous professional liability, and more recently spent time with CNA. He brings over 20 years' experience to our panel. And last but not least, Ryan Griffin, who very kindly stepped into our panel when our original moderator, Florence Levy, was unable to make it to the conference due to a death in the family. Ryan is Vice President in the Cyber and E&O practice at JLT Specialty Risk USA, where he provides a full range of brokerage services to clients across all industries with respect to cyber and E&O. Prior to joining JLT, Ryan served in various capacities with Aon Financial Services Group, during which time he completed a one-year secondment in London and is also was a consultant for Navigant Consulting in Washington, D.C. in New York. So I'd like to welcome our panelists and thank them all for sharing their expertise today. My name is Ann DeVries. I am the program manager for network security and privacy at Safehold Special Risk, which is a subsidiary of Wells Fargo Insurance Services. I have been in the insurance underwriting business since 1989 and have focused primarily on network security and privacy since the late 90s. So hopefully we can impart some of our collective experience on all of you. We're going to talk today a little bit about network exposures, network security, and privacy exposures in general. We want to talk a little bit about where it all started almost 20 years ago, the evolution of not only the exposures but also the insurance industry response, some of the legal climate that has driven not only exposure but also how we respond to data breaches and network security events. We'll talk a little bit about basic coverage under specialized network insurance, network security, and privacy policies, and we'll take you sort of through the basic anatomy of a data breach, touching on lessons learned and not only what to do, but more importantly, what not to do when a data breach occurs. So just for our panelists, I'd like to do a quick raise of hands with the audience. How many of you in here come from the underwriting community? Okay, what about brokers? Okay, and then risk management? Okay, legal, attorneys? Okay, well, we have pretty much an even mix, I think, in terms of all that. All right, for those of you who are in the room, how many for you is this the first cyber conference you've attended? Okay, all right, super. Well, welcome. We'll be talking a lot about exposures and protection and all that, but I think the important thing to remember here is that behind all of the technology, behind everything that we have in terms of risk management and protections and response services and everything else, there is a human element. So don't forget the human element. There is no such thing as a 100% secure network. There is no such thing as 100% secure data, because behind it all, there are always people, and people make mistakes. And that was just sort of a way to illustrate that we all have to keep in mind that we are human. So anyway, so let's move on to the panel. We're going to start off sort of with the birth of network security exposure and network security insurance. So we're going to we'll start with Evan. Take us back to the late 1990s when coverage first became available and many referred to it as network risk. What do we mean when we use the term network security, and why is it important to maintain a secure network?
Yeah, well, thanks, Ann. Hopefully everybody can hear me. If you can't, just raise your hand. Well, I think the idea of having dedicated coverage for cyber risks was born out of the fact that a lot of these exposures weren't covered on traditional insurance policies. These gaps in coverage obviously force the industry to innovate. We obviously all live in a day and age where data is often the lifeblood of an organization, more so than physical assets. So this idea of covering intangible assets and making sure that the organization has the appropriate protection if and when those assets are compromised or they're unable to use their network. So we can think about a lot of areas when we think about network risk. So just thinking about protecting a network, it can involve the use of physical controls. So making sure that something as simple as people coming into your office, you have locks, you have ID badges, things like that. That's something that I think often gets overlooked. Using passwords, obviously, it's often a people problem more so than a technology problem, making sure that people are changing their passwords regularly, using complex passwords, using multi-factor authentication, obviously using software such as firewalls, data loss prevention, intrusion detection systems. That's also a key aspect. But making sure that there's coverage when there's either a breach of your network security or if you're unable to actually use your computer systems to conduct your business, because obviously we all rely on email applications in our daily lives.
Yeah, and to that point, back in the mid to late 90s when this coverage was first born, it really was truly network security or network interruption coverage. Now we really focus on the privacy aspects, but back when this started, privacy was not even a word that existed in a cyber insurance policy. The primary concern, sort of on the tail of the dot-com boom in the mid-90s, was just systems being affected by some sort of a virus or a denial-of-service attack where authorized users were unable to access the system and access the information that they needed to access. And so the system interruption piece was really what was driving the need for some sort of protection. That obviously changed considerably back in 2003 when the state of California introduced Senate Bill 1386. It became law on July 1st of 2003. It was the very first consumer breach notification law, state notification law, to hit the books. And following that, many other states began to quickly follow suit, and now we've got 48 states that have consumer notification laws on the books, and that really was what gave birth to the whole privacy aspect in these insurance policies. And data breaches and breach of private information really became the focus of these policies and became the focus of legislation. And we've seen that sort of just explode over time. So just a little bit of background that when this first started, it really wasn't privacy at all. And now that seems to be really where we are. And interestingly, I think moving forward, obviously privacy will continue to be a major component of this, but I think we've barely even scratched the surface in terms of the whole network interruption aspect from like a business income standpoint. So you look at manufacturing industries or wholesale and distribution, our whole transportation network nationally, and how those could possibly be affected by some sort of a significant network interruption, and the first party related losses that may arise from that. And they even touched in the opening session about bodily injury and property damage and other types of things that can arise. So we are very, very early on in the evolution of exposures and of this coverage and our response to it, both from an insurance standpoint and a legal standpoint. And I think for those of you who are fairly new to cyber, you're definitely not too late to the game. There is much to look forward to, I think, and to learn about. And if any one of us ever claims to be an expert in this, we are lying, because there are no experts. We're all learning from each other every day. It is a fairly close-knit community, and we are continuing to learn as we go. So, with that, I also welcome any questions as we go through. We'd like to make this sort of conversational. I know our panelists will be supporting one another in that regard, and we'll move forward. So, Evan, staying with you, can you just touch on some of the sort of internal and external threats that we are seeing relative to security and privacy?
Yeah, of course. So internal threats, I think one thing that pops to mind immediately are the acts of rogue or disgruntled employees, particularly those in the IT department or might have higher access or credentials to the systems. Obviously, somebody might not be considered for a promotion. Maybe they've just been terminated, and they have some type of grudge that they hold against the organization. So they may want to either steal data to bring to their next job. They might want to just corrupt data so that it's not usable to make everyone else's lives a living hell. I think that's something that's often overlooked, possibly. And making sure that you have ways of controlling access and terminating access as soon as somebody is terminated is very important. Internal controls also have to do with training employees as far as, I know our speaker earlier, Shane McGee, mentioned phishing attacks, social engineering, making sure that people can really identify what a suspicious email is, know when not to click on links, know if somebody instructs somebody to wire money to an account that they're not familiar with, even if it's coming from the CEO of the organization, making sure that you're calling somebody or verifying that. Again, it goes back to the idea that it's often a people problem. External threats, I think Shane, again, did a really good job talking about threats from nation states, so politically motivated actors, sometimes financially motivated actors, looking for actual data on individuals, credit card information, protected health information. These are all obvious threats. In some cases, you can talk about an advanced persistent threat, which is one that's targeted at a specific organization, or you can talk about more broad-based attacks that try to capitalize on known vulnerabilities in software. So it really can come from all angles. A lot of times, we deal with smaller businesses usually that are looking for this coverage. A lot of them feel that they aren't Target, they aren't Neiman Marcus, they aren't Anthem, they therefore aren't targets, they aren't vulnerable. But something as simple as losing a laptop, having your laptop stolen, there's no hard disk encryption on that laptop, you might have sensitive information there. Not taking basic preventative steps can really harm an organization.
Can you just touch on some of the insurance coverage that is available to address some of these threats, just briefly?
Yeah, of course. Before you touched upon it with the business interruption or network interruption coverage. That's what we would consider to be a first-party insurance coverage or insuring agreement. So in the instance where you're unable to use the system, there's some period of interruption, it's reimbursing you for lost income during that period, and also paying costs that you incurred to get everything back up and running. But something probably from the first party side, something that most people think about when they think about cyber insurance is sort of the security event costs or breach response services that are built into it. Before there's any lawsuit or any regulatory action, it's actually taking the step to figure out, whether there was actually an intrusion into your system, when it first occurred, what steps need to be taken to stop that as soon as possible, notifying any of those individuals, all the legal fees that surround that. So that's really a key aspect of this coverage that I think is different from some other lines of business that a lot of us have dealt with in the past. On the other side of things is what we would call the third-party liability coverage. So in the instance that there's actually a claim or a suit brought against your organization, responding with defense costs or claim expenses, and then actually covering any judgments, damages made against the organization. And built into that might be regulatory action from the Office of Civil Rights in the case of a healthcare data breach. It might cover PCI, fines, assessments, penalties that arise out of a breach of payment card information. Other coverages that might be available include network extortion, something that has hit the news a lot. A lot of times it seems to be local police departments or fire departments. They'll they'll be attacked with ransomware where all of their sensitive files are encrypted. They can't access them unless they pay a certain sum of money, $50,000, $100,000, maybe more. That's something that there's coverage available for. So I think the product's really evolving a lot.
Question?
Oh, there's a question. I think there's a microphone, actually, but...
Is there
Okay,
one? Oh, no,
that's
there's
fine.
not. There's not one anyway. So yeah.
Oh, there isn't?
Yeah.
Just quickly, is there, this might be loaded, but is there some consistency within, across the providers in those buckets at least, or not really?
Yes and no. I mean, if somebody else wants to.
Yeah, I can take that one. I think that's a difficult question because we talk a lot about the industries that are impacted by this cyber risk, right? We talk about it as a peril. And the insurance solutions don't always align with the way the organization is aligned. But what you're finding is that to avoid issues around different buckets of costs, right? You've got this event that happens, and all of a sudden there's costs across the spectrum, right? From responding to the breach, investigating the breach, defending lawsuits, and then taking questions from regulators. Your costs are mounting quickly. And I think what the insurance industry has done a pretty good job of is start to look at this as one big bucket of money to spend, as opposed to going through. And this was one of the, this was actually a selling, there was an impediment to selling this product historically because where you needed coverage most, you only got $100,000 or $250,000. But I think what we found over the course of the last 4 years is these data breach events are big dollars. And so organizations and insurers now offer coverage fully across all these, shared under one aggregate limit of liability, so they're not worried about kind of aggregation. But to have $10 million to work with, for example, and not worry about spending $100,000 on an investigation and that running out, I think that's kind of the biggest lesson learned from these recent data breaches. So the quick answer is yes.
Yeah, I think the coverages are becoming more homogeneous across the various carriers. I mean, I think the terminology may vary from form to form or from carrier to carrier, but in terms of the basic structure of the policies and sort of the buckets of coverage that are available, I think we're starting to see a lot more consistency there. And definitely, as Ryan mentioned, getting away from a lot of the sublimiting and having the full policy limits available where they're needed, in the just based upon the nature of the event and what's necessary. So, okay, I'm going to move on to Jafir. I had touched earlier on the fact that privacy risks really didn't come into the fray until sort of the mid-2000s. Can you walk us through sort of your description of basic privacy coverage and how that might differ from some of the other things we've talked about?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a lot of overlap in between myself and kind of like what Evan has already touched on. I try to compartmentalize the form, and I think of the insurance piece, so you have your first party, your third party, or harm to others, and then the other component is the services portion. So that's the notification, public relations, credit monitoring, and call centers. But just in an effort to advance the ball a little bit up the field, these forms are not all identical. We use different terms, there's different pricing, and a lot of times maybe one might want to consider, well, is the coverage really found in the name? Okay, so you have different terms like network security. Based on that name, how might my coverage potentially be limited? Or cyber extortion, data privacy, cyber liability. And a general question from like me, an individual, if I'm a business owner, is like, okay, well, does that mean that I'm going to get coverage for paper documents? Does that mean that I'm going to have protection on my website? Does that mean that I'm going to have coverage for cash, bonds, or securities, or similar items in case my bank account is emptied by a hacker? So those are some of the considerations that one might want to consider. And another hot button for me personally is we always want to take a close look at the exclusions. Okay, what is our carrier saying? Hey, I don't want to cover. So when we look some of the more difficult exclusions, I think from a business standpoint, might be a failure to maintain exclusion. or a PCI exclusion, or an exclusion for a non-encrypted device or wireless network exclusion. So those are some of the things that I think one might want to pay particular attention to, because those types of issues or variances in form could be manifested in the face of a claim.
Even though there has been a lot more awareness now with regard to data breaches and what companies of various kinds may be exposed to, we still get a lot of pushback, and I think the brokers still get a lot of pushback with companies not really recognizing where their exposure lies and why they even need to consider purchasing any kind of coverage for security and privacy risks. So, Shafir, if you can just touch on, who are the targets and why?
Absolutely. I mean, we know over the past several years who some of the larger victims were. We know of Target, December 2013, eBay, May 2014, Home Depot, September 2014, and then in 2015, clearly the year of the healthcare hack. Obviously because of their data-rich medical records. But who else has exposures? Well, clearly law firms. We heard in our opening session this morning that law firms, they know about transactions, mergers, acquisitions, divestitures. They have their pulse on what's going on in the community in terms of intellectual property. And many might believe, hey, it's my job as an attorney to keep information quiet. Well, to Evan's point, what about that rogue employee? How is one's LPL, their lawyer's professional, going to respond in a case of a rogue employee? Colleges and universities, they're widely known for permissive use in terms of information. They're highly networked. It's a BYOD environment, bring your own device. And then we can think about like work-study programs. So students might work in financial aid, comptroller's office, admissions office, and have a lot of access to electronic or paper documents. From a manufacturing perspective, definitively, you think about the intellectual property that they have available, and they're certainly a target for state-sponsored cyber attacks. Again, if a nation can access a company and take their intellectual property and make their own widgets locally at a price advantage, it's clear. I'm kind of preaching to the choir here that it's obvious that there's threats out there, and organizations and governments are looking to do that. Also, I think about not-for-profits. Not-for-profits, generally can have a higher turnover in terms of volunteers with access to files outside of managerial control and oversight. Not-for-profits have donor lists. So long story short, we're all in this together, and I've heard it said recently that there's two types of organizations out there: those who have been hacked and those who don't realize it yet.
Can you touch a little bit on sort of the trends with regard to data breaches, and what are you seeing in terms of trending, and what are we looking at now in 2015?
Yeah, absolutely. Just some updated information that I've derived from Risk-Based Security. This is the data breach quick view, mid-year 2015 data breach trends. And what we've seen so far is there were 1,860 incidents exposing 228 million records. The business sector was highly impacted, resulting in 43% of organizations that were hacked. What's interesting, and I don't want to give you a lot of numbers, but something to consider, there were 17 incidents that exposed 1 million records or more. So when I think of a million or more, I mean, that's clearly catastrophic. But then in comparison to that, 1,860 incidents, how does that compare? Also, in terms of incidents exposed between 1 and 100 records, 40%. So what can we glean from this? Well, there's really no reason, potentially, to overinsure. But then I have to balance that and say it depends on the individual organization and what their what value they place on their data. So I think that's definitely a personal question in terms of how much capacity to look for in the marketplace, and then it's the insurance professionals, the brokers, and the insurance underwriters to determine exactly what the market will bear in terms of limits.
Yeah, I mean, from a privacy standpoint, knowing the number of records that you have exposed in your organization is very important, and I think you're going to start to see many more underwriters asking that specific question on applications. I know many already do. Mm-hmm. But since the crisis management piece, which is your notification, your credit monitoring, your forensics, that bucket of money, I guess, under the first party, that's really highly dependent on the number of records that could potentially be affected in a breach. So very important for you to sort of wrap your arms around what your real exposure is, and that will help you and the brokers sort of identify, what limits are necessary to purchase under one of these policies, because that's really a better gauge of your exposure as opposed to just pure revenue. I mean, the revenues are still used as a rating basis for the most part on these policies, but underwriters are looking very carefully at the actual exposures in terms of the number of unique records that could be affected in a given data breach. So. Aside from, we've seen a lot of malware-related breaches. Some of the breaches that have made large, the big headlines, are malware-related. A lot of them have to do with point-of-sale terminals and malware, sort of picking off information as it's streaming through the network. But in addition to that, what are some of the other, types of breaches that are occurring that are causing some of these really significant losses?
Yeah, absolutely. We've heard the term this morning about phishing. That's phishing, and that's where one is masquerading as a trusted entity in an electronic communication to obtain data. So hint, hint, wink, wink, don't click the link. Also skimming, to your point, using electronic device, a skimmer, to swipe and steal individual credit card numbers. So those are some of the things that can happen, but what else when we think about the human element? Well, think of, hey, can this happen to me? Computers, documents, disk drives not being disposed of properly. And then, obviously, the inevitable, at times it happens, the lost laptop. So, long story short, in conclusion, what I would say, at least for this piece, is that, risk transfer absolutely does make sense. It protects an organization from impaired financials, bankruptcy, and provides resources for brand or image repair. And with the patchwork quilt of breach notification laws out there, I would say it's almost next to impossible to really, really get a data breach right in terms of notification and adhering to state, federal, or international notification standards. It's almost impossible to do without some assistance. And, frankly, what we're finding out right now is it looks like the bad guys are a lot smarter than the good guys.
Yeah, we are, and I think it depends on the industry you're working in. Yep. I think the good news is financial institution bonds, which have been around since the 70s, and commercial crime policies, again, were written on forms that were written in the 1970s that didn't contemplate these schemes. The important part, whether it's covering it under a cyber policy or amending a commercial crime policy to cover those financial loss scenarios, it needs to go in one or the other. I'd say to date, the cyber underwriting community has not gotten their arms completely around those straight schemes where the funds are going to a fictitious account, but it looked like it was an authorized transaction. Mm-hmm. So I'd say today there's certainly a gap. The crime market has stepped up and responded by offering coverage. The key is underwriting that risk. Underwriters are going to want to look at the controls that are being used. Are they using the proper are they actually authenticating those two ways? And oftentimes they're not going to talk about key exclusions. Underwriters are not going to cover you for losses when you've ignored your own internal controls. So I think that's the balancing act right now, is finding the right place. And right now it's probably under a commercial crime policy.
Okay, Ryan will
There's
continue.
another question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Actually, yeah.
Go ahead.
That's okay.
Some of the clients I'm seeing are now being, as part of the larger risk management process, are being required to get cyber insurance. So can you guys talk to that, how often that's happening? It's obviously good for business.
Yeah.
I mean,
I could even talk a little bit about that vendor. It really has to do with a lot of vendors, right?
Yeah.
So you'll have a hospital or you'll have a bank that works with vendors, and routinely they will hand over that sensitive data to that vendor to perform a certain function. And so the concern there is what happens if there's a breach at the vendor level, okay? And one thing you got to bear in mind is that if you are the original data collector, you're the bank or you're that hospital, you still have the legal obligation to notify the affected individuals, and you're going to incur a number of expenses. So there's a lot of concern there. Okay, I want to incur those expenses. How am I going to recover those expenses, especially if it's not my fault, if it's my vendor's negligence? Okay, so I want to go back eventually when the dust settles and recover those costs. So we're seeing a lot of that with vendor management, and that's baked into a lot of contracts with the vendors, saying you need to carry $1 million in coverage and so forth. So.
and actually, you just want to also make sure that, hey, your form will pick up coverage when your personally identifiable information is entrusted to a third party, perhaps a cloud provider. You want to make sure that there's that extension for the permissive use for them to hold that data.
Yeah, and just to add, there's usually a certificate of insurance that they say, okay, we got $1 million in coverage. That's really just part of the story, because you may have a sublimit baked into that to say, okay, the crisis management expenses, the legal costs, and the IT forensics, it's 1/10 of that. Okay, so it's not really $1 million, or maybe $100,000. There's a sublimit. So you really want to really dig into the detail of your vendor's cyber policy. Question?
Just a follow-up question on the comment made by Mr. Griffin. So if we look at risk as classically defined as likelihood times impact, and we've talked a lot about the impact part of it, the business continuity, the revenues. On the likelihood side, when Mr. Griffin was talking about asking what type of authentication controls are in place, I would love to hear from everyone on the panel. What extent do you go to validate controls? Because when you're sitting in front of when you ask anyone an assessment set of questionnaires, it's really up to them to tell you what they think they're doing, what they may be doing. So I would be interested in how do you assess the likelihood piece, the controls in place? Do you just ask questions? Do you go out and actually validate controls? How deep is everyone going? Because the same issue that's been existing forever in third-party vendor management is existing right now in underwriting. So I would love to hear what type of assessment is being done, and how far do you go to validate controls?
I would say that it really depends on the size of organization that's looking for coverage. I mean, from an ease of doing business standpoint, as underwriters, we can't go in and do, security assessments on every risk, every small nonprofit, every small business. But when you're looking at, large Fortune 500 companies that are seeking 100 million plus towers, you're having underwriting calls, you're having calls with the IT department, in some cases visiting the organization itself. So it is a balancing act of, what information can we reasonably get? What industries are we really seeing the risks? If we're looking at colleges and universities or larger law firms, maybe we need to be asking more questions.
Yeah, and there's also some standards out there now. The NIST framework, you may have heard about that, but that was basically a combination of the federal government taking ideas from the private sector and some of the best practices for a framework of security, and it was geared towards protecting critical infrastructure. Okay, so there are best practices out there, and then what we're finding is that a lot of organizations are following those standards, because it's been pretty much agreed upon at the federal government level and some of the leading security experts in the private sector that this is a great framework to follow for critical infrastructure. And if it's good enough for them, it's probably good enough for some smaller, less sophisticated organizations.
And another point that we want to keep in mind is the application is very important. Admittedly, some of the applications are verbose and daunting at times, but we really want to make sure we get the right information, and the person who has knowledge of the management information systems, the security controls, impairment tests, or everything that's going on in terms of security controls, we want to make sure the right person fills out the application, because we really are relying on that, especially for the smaller transactional accounts. Obviously, larger accounts, we can do one-on-one visits, on-site visits, conference calls, but definitively, we're reliant on the application.
Well, and I was going to say, for the Fortune 500 risks that truly have those $1 million or million-person loss scenarios, it requires intense underwriting. I would say site visits, getting the right people involved within organizations, I think is the biggest struggle today on the client side, because your access points could be risk, could be legal, could be in the security office. And getting those three to work together to put together a true submission of where they stand relative to best practices. And that takes a massive amount of work. And then to kind of quantify that to figure out, well, what is this impact going to look like for my organization? And I think it really differs organization to organization based on, we talk about this all the time, but network architecture is different in every organization. I wish we could say that it was homogenous across an industry, but you could work with two grocery stores that are next door to each other, and their network architecture is going to be completely different. And honestly, as someone who works with the underwriting community every day, I feel for them trying to risk $10 million at a time guessing on some of these questions that they're asking. They're relying on a person's opinion.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Just drilling down on that. Just like you said, oftentimes when you're asking someone something, you're relying on their opinion and what they believe is actually happening. Are you ever going to and that's a tabletop discussion assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Are you ever going to the point of validating controls to actually have someone come on site from your organization, a third party, and actually ask for their policies, look at their configuration files to be sure that what they are actually doing matches what they believe they're doing? Because in a breach scenario, it's what they're actually doing is going to be the break.
Yeah, I think that's clearly the natural progression of things. I know many organizations are having those discussions just to kind of like help mitigate future risks. So, I think you're right in line, and I think it's a reasonable expectation from the insurance buyer.
But is that happening? I don't mean
It is actually happening. Like they said, it depends on the size of the risk and the limits that are being put up. But you are seeing more and more carriers engage third-party vendors like Net Diligence and others to actually go on site and do network security assessments. And whether they do that from externally and just sort of rattling windows and doors, or whether they're going on site and really looking at the nuts and bolts and talking to the people who are managing the network and responsible for the data, we are seeing more of that, engaging third parties to go in and validate the information that we're receiving on the applications. Unfortunately, we don't have 90 to 120 days lead time on every account that we underwrite. Sometimes we need to turn around a quote tomorrow. So, we have to work within the confines of the marketplace and competition and everything else. But, I think we are trying to do a better job as underwriters on validating information that we're receiving and really trying to understand the risks that we're putting up the capacity on. But it's certainly not a perfect science. So, yes.
In a situation where perhaps a law firm where a company has third parties' confidential corporate information, so as opposed to the typical privacy, the volume of records is the main determiner of how you value the risk. Where there's a situation where a company might hold very few records, but the loss of even one of those records might be extremely valuable. From an underwriting perspective, how do you approach, valuing that risk or assessing that risk?
Well, I would say that it's difficult, as you can imagine.
That's why we looked at each other.
and that's why, you think about law firms. That's come up several times already, and I think that's one of the big concerns with law firms. You have intellectual property, you have trade secrets, other corporate confidential information. It's a good question to ask to make sure that whatever policy, as a buyer, if you're buying an insurance policy, that it does cover that corporate confidential information. But then the question comes up of limit adequacy. Like, you can imagine, tens of millions of dollars settlements out of some of this. And how do you quantify what the value of that intellectual property is? So
yeah, generally I would say the insurance policies are not designed today to respond to that risk. I think, Barnum, the valuation of the theft of intellectual property is just not there. Organizations can't even value it internally, let alone allow underwriters to do it. But where we know these policies work on a basic level is figuring out what happened. And I think that's where we hope that it matures to the point where we can kind of get to the point of value the intellectual property side. But the costs associated with just investigating and determining exactly what happened, that might be reason enough to carry this insurance policy. And I think that's where we're seeing the progression from retail, healthcare, technology companies buying to other companies using it as a retainer agreement to have the best people come in and figure out what happened and what are the best practices to implement. I think Jen will talk a little bit about that in terms of lessons learned. I hope we get there someday, but it's a two-way street. Organizations need to help underwriters kind of come up with a value. If we can come up with a value for it, I think we can insure it. It's just neither party wants to flinch, and I think that's kind of where we're at today.
There actually was an attempt many years ago, I would say early 2000s, to actually schedule intellectual property on these policies and as basically a valued form and to schedule IP. There were a couple of London forums that did that. It just never really took any kind of a foothold, and I think for a lot of the reasons that were just stated, it's just coming to an agreement on value, and then just the expense to cover something like that was just really cost prohibitive, and they never really took off. So anyway, okay, I've gotten a 10-minute signal, so I'm going to move on. I'd like very much like for John to talk a little bit about sort of the anatomy of a data breach. And 5 minutes now? How did I go to 10 minutes to 5 minutes and 3 minutes? Or 2 minutes?
Oh, boy. Well, I'm from New York. Okay. I'll talk fast.
Right. So anyway, yeah, if you could just sort of take
real
us
quick.
through
We talked a bit about this, but when you have a data breach, you're going to need to engage a lot of experts outside your firm. First would be a privacy attorney that is very experienced in the data breach notification laws, because you have a legal duty to notify those affected individuals, and each state has their own mandated way and form of how to notify those folks. There are timing issues in certain states. Some want it within 30 days, others want 45 days. Others want notification to the Attorney General. Certain states want certain things said in the letter and certain things not said in the letter. So a privacy attorney that understands the state statutes that, by the way, are constantly changing. We had 9 revisions this year alone. So you really need an expert that focuses on this all day, every day from a legal standpoint. The next expert you're going to need to bring in is an IT forensics firm. Extremely important, because what these folks do is they track the digital footprints of that hacker, and they will be able to tell you definitively what was hacked, what was not hacked, when they were in, and when you got them out. Because that report is going to be your defense in a court of law. It's going to be the basis for the letter that you send out, and it's going to be the basis for a discussion with certain attorney generals that will get the letter. So you want to demonstrate that you did your homework. You did a full and complete investigation. You took it seriously, a crucial part of that. And by the way, when you have the IT forensics firm hired, make sure your privacy attorney hires the IT forensics firm on your behalf. The reason I say that is that it protects attorney-client privilege when they do that. So it's not going to be just turned over to the other side, to the plaintiff's firms that will sue you as soon as they get the letter. So very important part there. Then you're going to have to consider a call center. You may not have the wherewithal to handle 100,000 phone calls coming in. So there are vendors where you could set up a call center, okay, and they will handle the calls. You want to make sure you're answering calls properly. You have enough staff at that vendor so there's not a long wait time and you infuriate the public even more. So have that. Credit monitoring is routinely offered as well. And credit monitoring can mean a number of different things. I mean, you could offer it for 1 year. You could offer it for 2 or 3 years. You can offer it for 1 bureau of monitoring or 3 bureau. And all of these decisions will impact cost. So just be aware of that. It's not just 1 year. Certain attorney generals will ask for 2, even though they don't have a legal mandate to base that on. but you don't want to get into an argument with the Attorney General. If he wants to, validate that with your insurance company that they're okay with that, and offer 2. Now, if you got multiple states, do you want to offer 2 in one state and then 1 to the rest? You probably don't want to do that, because if word gets out that you're doing that, you can have an uproar. So you want to be consistent on what you offer, okay? You may need a public relations firm to help you deal with the press that asks lots of questions, and that is another vendor you'd bring in. And by the way, these are all typically covered under a cyber insurance policy, under the crisis management expenses portion of the policy. Many of the carriers have relationships with these vendors. They've got discounted rates, and these are experts that do data breach response all day, every day, and they're really good at what they do. So it's a complex response, but with the right people in place, you can really mitigate the damage and the financial and reputational harm that might result. A question?
So for everything that you just identified, I think one of the perks that a lot of my clients like in cyber policies is having the carrier essentially walk them through that whole process. It's almost, I'm not going to have to contact all those 5 different people.
Yep.
I'm going to reach out to my carrier, and they're going to essentially walk me through the whole process.
Absolutely. They do it all day, every day, so they know exactly when to bring in these experts and who to bring in. So yes, absolutely, you can rely on your broker or your insurance carrier to kind of weigh in that breach response, which usually is about a 30 to 60-day process. Getting through that crisis, that's when about how much time it takes.
And just in terms of pairing companies with insurance companies, it's about kind of with the spectrum of where they want to be. Do they want to be turnkey? Do they want to hand it all over to the insurance company and say, go and do this? If they do, there's a product available for that. There's cyber policies that do that really well. If mature organizations that know exactly who they like to work with from a forensic standpoint, you can customize it, and the underwriting community has responded in either allowing the client to determine who they partner with or allow the insurance company to determine who they partner with. And so it's a really nice blend of a policy fit to the right company.
In what's typically offered, though, in those policies, which is great, what isn't typically included that you'd want to have added, or that you need to move forward with in the event of a claim?
Yeah, I would say the 3 standard pieces that are almost in every policy is the data breach response piece that John was just talking about, the network security and privacy liability. That's sort of a bare minimum. But I think organizations need to evaluate the chances of a network interruption. And I think that's an availability of coverage. If you ask a lot of the underwriters in the room, they'd probably say they've never paid claims under that area of the policy because the wait times are so high. Organizations, I mean, Facebook's had 3 outages in the last month. None of them would have even come close to a waiting period. And so I think that's an area where, armed with the right information, underwriters can offer valuable coverage. The question becomes, how long is an outage? And I think that area paired with cyber extortion, as that becomes a bigger threat and a more common frequency issue, same idea. You want the right resources to respond to an extortion attempt. You don't want to be negotiating that for the first time. You want to work with an insurance company that has done it regularly.
Yeah, we're seeing ransomware happen all the time now, and we're seeing relatively small amounts being demanded to decrypt your information. And we're seeing a lot of organizations pay that, really to release that information and let them continue doing business, because you could have a much bigger interruption of your business, especially if you're a seasonal business. It's Christmas time and you're locked out of your data and your network, and days are going by. Those payments are being made, and they're usually not that costly. It's usually a few $1,000s.
And you can lean on the insurance companies and their experts to say, is this a valid threat? Is this a common threat? Is this a reasonable amount to pay? I think with them seeing it daily, I think that's a good sounding board for decision making.
After people are found out that, hey, we pay, are you seeing multiple attempts on them?
Well, I think what you do after that, the dust settles, you really find out how they got in, and you do what you can to prevent it from happening again. So there's a lessons learned sort of process that you go through, and really shore up those defenses and make sure it doesn't happen again.
I'm afraid they're going to bring out the cane. We have time for one more question, and then they're going to kick us off. So, go ahead. Yeah, that's fine.
I'm also really curious sort of about, so if you could expand on some around what is in my organization deals with secure encryption and key management, so the preventative side of data security. And so a lot of the education we have to do to decision makers is around, a lot of the attitudes we come up against are, that I'll just pay the fine attitude because that'll be less expensive than if I implement the security. So what I'm really curious about, just it would help us from the educational point of view, is how much does the insurance cover in terms of the overall cost? The cost. I mean, there are things that are sort of unmeasurable, like brand damage, and if you're a decision maker, those folks who are losing their jobs at the top. And it's just curious if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, I would say the one I can tell you the easy answer of what's not covered is the cost to upgrade. I think that's the biggest piece that clients misunderstand post-breach is, hey, we've investigated it, we've remediated it, but if you're going to go in and just purchase a bunch of good software solutions and potentially new hardware, that's not insured under these policies. And I think maybe it should be, but I think then there's some unwanted priorities. You want to get hacked to go get a better system from your insurance policy. So
A little moral hazard there.
we're not there yet.
Okay, folks, I think we need to wrap it up. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today, and thank you for your questions. We are all available to you, so if you have other questions that we didn't have time for, please feel free to approach any one of us anytime throughout the conference, and we'll be happy to answer anything you have. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.